Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of our Ask the Experts webinar series. Today, we will be talking about how a very important and timely topic, managing challenging residents. With everything going on these days, from economic uncertainty to the rising costs, effects of social media, and political polarization, it's no wonder nerves are frayed, stress levels are up, and tempers are running short. Even the best of us can find ourselves behaving less than our normal selves. What's a board to do in the face of conflict with residents, or worse, when behavior becomes out of line towards staff and board members? We know it can happen, and we're here to help. My name is Amy Sanchez, and I'm the president of FirstService Residential's Central Florida Division, and I get to be your moderator for today. We have a few housekeeping items before I introduce our panel and get to our discussion. First, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please submit them through our Q&A option on your control panel. We will do our best to answer them during our discussion, and any that are missed will be answered by our team following today's session. Next, there's no need to take notes. We will be recording today's session and sending it to all attendees. You will be able to share with your fellow board members, family, or friends who you might think will find it useful. In addition, we'll be posting an article called Resident Conflict: How to Handle Difficult Situations Like a Pro. You'll be able to find this in the chat and can bookmark the link for future reference. And now, introduce our panelists. Joining me today are industry experts, Hannah Field, Regional Director at FirstService Residential, and Dan Greenberg, a partner at Greenberg Nickoloff, PA, a firm specializing in community association law.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, very much looking forward to today's discussion, Hannah and Dan. Today, we're going to be covering some real life examples of conflict we've seen arise and best practices for how to handle these situations. These techniques will help board members just like you, as well as team members and associates, to build a more positive community for all to enjoy. So without further ado, let's get started. You know, I find that managing resident conflict is such a broad-ranging topic that before we can discuss the tactics, we need to first understand where it's coming from. Hannah, can you kick us off by sharing how we can better understand the root cause of resident concerns and stress?
Absolutely. Thank you, Amy. I think it's very evident that in today's world, people are just generally more under pressure for a whole variety of reasons, some of which you mentioned right at the very beginning: rising costs, speed of change, and the volume of content that we are consuming on a daily basis. I think it's also true that social behavior has changed over the last few years. People just tend to be more confident to express their concerns and their dislike, their opinions about certain situations. And unfortunately, that has rolled over into our day-to-day life of property management. We also cannot underestimate the impact that social media has had on all of our residents and all of our daily lives. People get to express their opinions, and they're also exposed to things that they possibly would never have been exposed to previously. All of today's society with the polarized political environment and world events, all the things that are going on around the world and in this country today, and all of that can just lead and add to heightened tensions.
Yeah, absolutely. I had even heard on the radio this morning how a Gallup poll says that most are getting far less sleep as well. So we've got all this stuff going on, you know, everything's moving, we're taking in all this content, we're getting less sleep. So it's no wonder everybody's more stressed out and people are a little bit more on edge and tensions are up.
Yeah.
And what's your take? Do you have anything to add on this?
Yeah, and remember, all these things Hannah has said are true, and people are bringing all of those factors into their home. I constantly am reminding, you know, my colleagues here that we are dealing with people in their most intimate setting, their home, where they feel like they are the master of their own domain. It's oftentimes the place that people can let loose and let their mask down and create their own values and priorities. And a lot of times this can lead to people acting a little bit more selfishly or defensively or aggressively than they might otherwise do so in public or certainly at work. This is something that we've been increasingly dealing with for all the variety of reasons that Hannah has said. And folks, despite having bought into a deed restricted community, oftentimes kind of feel entitled to act the way that they want to act, express themselves unprofessionally, even though they may have just literally left the boardroom at their office and walked into our boardroom at the facility, and it's no holds barred. So we see a lot of bad behavior that's being brought down to the home and then spilling out into the community. And I know that's probably the part of the reason for having this session today. And we're also dealing with a burgeoning mental health crisis in this country and certainly in this state. I think that that has greatly contributed to some of the things and behaviors that we're seeing. As personal issues and conflict have really sort of spilled out over into neighbors and into common spaces. So this has been an alarming trend that we've seen an uptick in the last few years and that we're all really struggling to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. It's a great point, making today's topic really important and for us to get into the specifics a bit about what we're seeing, because those type of real life situations can help us better handle, know how to handle them as they arise. So Hannah, I'd love to kick it back to you and see, can you share with us a little bit about what you're actually seeing in the communities? What type of escalations are rising? And how are our boards and our professional management teams handling those scenarios?
Yeah, so lots to talk about on this topic. So let me start off by talking how we as a management team try and help our boards to combat these scenarios. And here at FirstService Residential, as part of our corporate culture, we talk a lot about moods and positive thoughts. And we have actually what's called a mood elevator. And right in the middle of the mood elevator is a mood that we really try to adopt on a day-to-day basis, and that is to be curious. And so we talk to our boards and our managers around that all the time, because these positive thoughts lead to proactive and successful behaviors. And we have to get comfortable with having the tough conversations. And not every tough conversation leads to conflict, right? If we go into it with an open, curious mind as to what our residents want to hear and what our boards can share with them around what's the best way to manage our organizations, can often lead to very, very productive, constructive conversations. It doesn't have to be a conflict environment. But unfortunately, one of the most common examples I've seen of where conflict grows is where there is a perceived lack of transparency and information provided by the board, which then in turn, which leads to people who feel that there could be potentially ulterior motives, which then leads to confusion. A lack of information and a lack of answers just ultimately leads to conspiracy theories, which then just leads to unrest within the association. Mm-hmm. And the biggest advice I give to my boards to try and combat any of this right from out the gate is work out what are the best and most frequent open channels of communication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Big advice there. Love what you said. Not every tough conversation has to lead to conflict. And your number one way to handle that is through communication.
Yeah. So we have to talk about what kind of communication we're using, right? As we have talked about, often we talk about within our different communities, how people receive their information is generational. Right? And we have lots of different tools these days. So you have to determine with your board and with your manager and with your community, what's the best way to communicate to your associations. Firstly, you have to have meetings. You have to have meetings and you have to give people notice. A lot of people know, and especially in Florida, the statute in Florida determines that you only have to give 48 hours notice. But if you want to communicate to your association, if you want to give the residents time to plan and be able to attend these meetings, especially if there's something very important on the agenda, such as very large projects, that are going to have a financial implication to them. Maybe it's a large contract that needs to be re-signed. Maybe it's a service that we provide on a day-to-day basis that we're talking about changing, that's going to have a daily impact on the residents. We have to give them time to attend. And so a good practice that I've seen in a couple of my associations is maybe you don't have the specific agenda items ready to be communicated or sent out to the owners. So once the board has committed to a date and they've decided when the meeting's going to be had, send out a save the date email, put up a notice in the elevator. There will be a meeting in 10 days time. So people can plan, and then within the 48-hour notice, then you have the agenda item set and you can send that out to meet the statutory requirements. But you have to give the people time to plan to be able to come so we can have these good, open, honest conversations.
Hannah, what I'm hearing from you is that what it sounds like is that really the ball is in our court. The ball is in the professional management team court and or the board's court to be able to proactively minimize conflict from arising, right? If the bulk of conflict is happening because people are confused, they don't know how to solve problems, being proactive on your communication, using multiple streams to reach out to people, to connect with people, and then having open doored sessions where you're holding meetings. Naturally, if you're worried about conflicts, a normal, natural reaction to that is to say, to avoid hosting meetings, but the exact opposite can de-escalate situations, right? Create greater accessibility for residents to hear what's going on and to be in the know. And so that can be very helpful. Dan, do you have context that, from your perspective, that you might want to add on that topic?
Right, and so keep in mind too, and this is why this is such an important topic. Hannah's really describing conflict between potentially the board and its membership, which is really only one of the types of conflicts that we are presented with on a regular basis. So that's our internal conflict. A lot of times boards, that's enough of a struggle, and we're going to talk about tips to resolve that, but the board is often trying to resolve external conflicts as well. So we have owner-to-owner issues that the board is now presented with to try to resolve. We have issues with vendors, performance related, and we have to resolve those as well. So the board seemingly is always in the middle of trying to resolve some kind of contentious situation. And just to spend a moment on those outside conflicts, because this is a question that comes up to us regularly, and I'm sure that you get presented with this as well. The boards often ask us, do we have to be involved, and to what extent, with what they deem to be owner-to-owner conflicts? So if we could spend a minute there, I think that would be useful. Unfortunately, I can't give you the answer that we can simply ignore all, quote, owner-to-owner conflicts. And the reason being is that most declarations for condos or HOAs have a nuisance provision or some other similar provision that says owners can't act in a way that just disturbs the peace or creates nuisance or annoyance to other residents. Well, it doesn't necessarily tell us how many residents they have to be annoying or harassing in order for it to be considered a nuisance. So if we're in a community where one resident's actions just happen to only be affecting, one or two neighboring properties, those owners deserve the peaceful use and enjoyment of their property. If the owner is creating an action or doing a thing that is directly causing that nuisance behavior, I think the board has an obligation under the declaration to address that situation as a violation. We can't simply pass the buck off to the affected owner and say, deal with it yourself. Certain disputes certainly can be handled by outside agencies. Call the police if there's a noise issue. Don't call the board or management at 2 a.m. Call the police. If you're being threatened and it's a violent situation or a criminal situation, call the police. But if we're having, sight, sound, smell, noise type of situations that come up that are really within our jurisdiction, the board has to be prepared to step in and treat that, as a violation. And with respect to vendors, contractors that we're dealing with, best piece of advice there, and this is probably content for another show entirely, but make sure you are protecting yourself on paper up front so that we can more easily resolve conflicts with vendors. We want to push those towards alternative dispute resolution, get to mediations quicker, build sit downs and inspections into our protocol when we're on a big project so that we can pause and inspect, rather than get to the end of a project and find out that we have a whole host of problems. Maybe we can nip it in the bud early. So this is where the board simply has to have the good guidance on the front end so that they can sort of see around the corner and hopefully try to anticipate and avoid some of these avoidable conflicts.
Yeah, what I appreciate about what you said is also being proactive again, right? That seems to be a common theme, communication and proactivity here, but not to ignore what's going on, right? And there can and should be policies set into place for how to respond. That way you're not picking up from scratch and trying to figure it out as you go. If you have a standard workflow to follow through to resolve items, then it becomes that much easier for and more efficient for the board to operate. I would add on to that the need for the human element too, right? I mean, Dan and Hannah, you see this often where everybody's frustrated. Maybe both parties believe that they're right, but bringing that human element of not necessarily being the first to just send a letter, right? But placing a phone call. Sometimes people don't realize what's going on. And being able to have a human approach to that can really disarm people from getting frustrated. I find that that tends to work more often than not when you start to put policy against people who are frustrated, then you lose that human connection. And that's really used as like a next level step, right? You've tried the human approach, nobody's listening and responding. And then you can take it to that next step to follow whatever the policies are for your community. But you can't follow the policies if you don't have them set out, right? So you certainly want to be working with your association council and your professional management team to define what that is going to look like. So I think for our audience, what might be helpful here is if we talk about some real life examples of scenarios where maybe there's frustration that's taking place. Possibly if you have a homeowner who's sending to your management team or to your board, 4 or 5 plus emails every day. That seems to be a common occurrence that comes up. It was one of the questions that was posed to us before the webinar starts, which is how do you, it's a lesser degree, it's not violence, right? So a little bit less clear cut. We often see boards ignoring situations that are a little bit softer, but it's still causing a bit of agita. How, Hannah, what's your take on how to handle a situation like that?
Well, absolutely. From a management perspective, don't ignore it. Never ignore it, because it can become a bigger problem very, very quickly. And for a lot of managers and boards alone, there's a first time for everything, right? Most of us have never been in this scenario before. We're not in the world where conflict is something that we deal with on a regular basis. So one of my true standby emotions is if it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't right. So if you have somebody who is doing that, who is a persistent problem, reach out and ask for help. Mm-hmm. Don't ignore it and don't try and pretend it's going to go away. And most often not, discuss it with the board and then of course your association council. This is what this person is doing. What is the best way forward for me to address this so that we can de-escalate, we can find a resolution, and we can move forward. Also, again, great advice for new managers or just managers. And again, you may have been in this role a very long time, but just never had to deal with a lot of conflict, is never be in these situations on your own. Always have someone else in your management office if the person is there. Always keep your door open. And often we try and encourage people to go to a public space if you have a social room or somewhere where that you're not confined into a small space with somebody that may get agitated. But again, it's always bring in the advice of your association council and never tackle these things alone and don't ignore them.
Yeah, I agree. And Amy alluded to this earlier, having a policy in place is really for the protection of the association and the board and management team. And the goal of a communication policy is not to shut down communication between the membership and the board. The reality is some of you, watching today are managing or operating communities of hundreds or perhaps thousands of homes or units. That is a monumental task, and you have limited resources, both financially and mentally. So the goal of setting up a policy is just to channel the day-to-day communications to the appropriate party. You engage a property manager for a reason. Part of their job is to facilitate this kind of communication between the membership and the board in a professional and productive way, and also protect the association from a legal standpoint, because you have record keeping duties with all of these communications as well. So oftentimes the policies are going to say, send your communication in writing to the property manager so that they can be basically the conduit for your question and hopefully an answer. And the policy also protects us legally, because we have obligations, particularly in the condo context, to respond within certain time periods. So when an owner sends us, for example, a certified written inquiry, we'll have a 30-day window to provide substantive response or consult with legal counsel to get an extension on that. So we want to make sure, or with a records inspection on both condos and HOAs, when that comes in from an owner, we have 10 business days within which to respond and make those records available. Now, if that request just comes in through an email to a random director who happens to be on vacation for a month, we're not going to get to that request, and we will have violated the law. So it's not to be onerous on the member and try to make them jump through hoops, but we're running a corporation, and we have to be mindful of the fact that we're highly regulated by the law, and there are real penalties for not communicating in a timely or appropriate manner. So I'm always a fan of having written protocols in place, communicating those to the membership, and leaving the day-to-day between meeting communication to the management team. Board members are also owners. They're volunteers. They deserve the peaceful use of their properties and the common areas as well. This is not a full-time paid job for them, and it shouldn't be the expectation. So in order to strike that balance and really encourage people to volunteer or continue volunteering for their community, we have to protect the integrity of their ability to live within the community as well. They're not always at work.
And a couple of points I can just jump on there to continue what Dan has been saying, is that absolutely, don't be the middleman when you're a board member. So completely supporting what Dan just said. As the management team, often we have a lot more information or resources that we can provide to the owner when they have questions as to X, Y, and Z was decided, or the violation, or whatever it may have been. So redirect the resident to the management team so they can give them all the information, and also possibly re-explain the communication policy to the owners if they weren't aware of all these steps of it. And then the most important thing from an operational standpoint is, once these policies are created, communication policies, a violation, the rules and regulations and the violations policies, you absolutely have to be consistent in how you apply them.
Yeah.
If there starts to be any exceptions made at any point throughout the process, that only leads to further conflict. You cannot have a publicized rules and regulations, or publicized rules and regulations and a violation process that is inconsistent and applied inconsistently throughout the community. That just leads to a whole world of trouble.
Yeah, it's a great point, Hannah. And it's even tougher for new board members that are coming in who might not have the history or legacy for how things were being applied. And then now we've got to keep things consistent. So that's where your management partners can really help.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I'd love for us to talk about today is, and Dan, you brought it up briefly earlier, in severe instances where there is a threat, right? There's perceived violence. Because we do get and can see in our industry a variety of things, some smaller things, the multiple emails, right, at a time, or somebody just physically standing outside of a building. But what happens when it escalates to a more severe situation and there's someone who has threatened violence, be it resident against resident or against the management team or even a board member? We hate that this happens. We know that it can. What's your take on this, Dan, and how should we respond?
Yeah, this is unfortunately happening at a more increasingly alarming rate. recently in this state. I've been doing this for 14 years now, and I can tell you, and all of my colleagues, echo these sentiments that we've never quite seen this level of conflict before. Including violent conflict within our communities. And first thing I can tell you is, we are not in a position as an association, as a not-for-profit, corporation, to provide security forces, to our residents. That is the job of local law enforcement. So I really think it's important to draw a distinction between the level of service that we provide and the response that we provide to an actual threat of violence or an actual perpetration of violence. That is squarely a criminal matter. Now, the issue is that potentially before something escalates to an actual act of physical violence, law enforcement may sometimes tell us that this is not a criminal matter, this is a civil matter. And what they mean is that, short of police intervention and an arrest and a criminal prosecution, there may be opportunity for a civil injunction to be levied against an individual that is levying threats, whether physical or online and cyber stalking, essentially, where we can receive injunctive relief to have a no contact order, basically, between that resident and the other resident, board member, management team member, etc. Now, this is where, again, it gets into drawing our lines. If this is an owner-to-owner dispute, we have to advise the owner who's being affected to go seek their own legal counsel, seek their own injunctive relief. If there's a threat of violence against them or stalking or harassment against them, they need to step up and defend themselves. Whereas the association can step in and defend a board member or a member of management because we have a duty to do so. Our job is to provide a safe working environment for our staff, for example. So if we have owners coming in, threatening staff, harassing staff, whether in person or online, that's the association's duty to work with the management team to step up and defend and protect those individuals. Same is true for board members who are only getting harassed or being threatened by virtue of their service to the community. It would have a tremendously chilling effect on board members' willingness to serve if the association did not step up and seek those civil remedies to try to tamp that down. So we need to work in partnership with local law enforcement. Usually there's a community liaison officer who's assigned to your jurisdiction. Those folks are happy to come in and make presentations to the board and the membership. They can attend a meeting or two. They can work with a local association committee like a neighborhood watch to establish best practices and protocols. So we're on the lookout for these things and can be preventative. But unless you actually employ a security service that will step in and essentially do the work of law enforcement while we're waiting for law enforcement to arrive, board members and certainly not management should not be interjecting themselves into these situations. We should be calling law enforcement and we should be working with the association attorney to see if there are civil remedies to get injunctive relief to prevent this from happening.
And actually here we were intentionally talking about severe situations where there's a higher level of tension, somebody's made a threat. And while that's smaller, it can happen. And so it's best to be prepared for in advance before it does, so you know what and how to respond. And naturally, usually there's some type of escalation that happens to get to that point. And so if you can do the pieces that Hannah was mentioning earlier about being proactive, taking a human approach to helping people resolve matters, making sure you have an open forum, most of those steps can mitigate this. But it does, even when you do all the best laid plans, it doesn't necessarily get you there. And a big way that we can handle that is in meetings, how we treat people, how we're talking to people. And one of the things that came up in was a question that was served to us earlier, and Dan would love your thoughts on this, is around videotaping. So we're of a new age, a digital age, right, where homeowners can show up to board meetings. They're open, they're intended to be for the membership. And now we've got homeowners who might pull out their smartphone and start to record. And so one of the questions that we got was, how should boards handle residents who use personal devices, smartphones, to record interactions and meetings? What's your take on that?
Well, that's statutorily protected activity. So both the statutes for condos and HOAs allow for owners to audio or video record meetings. Now, this gets us though back to the policy, because that can be a little jarring or alarming or disruptive when this all kind of happens in real time and is unfolding in a more contentious way. What we ask people to do, and we include these in the communication policies, is advise members, yes, you have a right to record our meetings. We welcome that. We, the board and management team, are going to act professionally in this setting. We have nothing to hide. By all means, record. So what we ask in the policies is typically for the member to announce that they're going to record the meeting. Usually we would want them to keep their recording device in a static location so that it's not disruptive to the meeting. We also ask that they keep the device on for the entire meeting so that we actually capture the totality of what is said and not piecemeal, so things are taken out of context. And then also that video cannot be distributed out in public forums. We are running a private corporation. Our business is not to be distributed out on YouTube or Facebook or the like, to the world at large. That can actually have negative consequences for our community and our residents, whether it's sales prices or otherwise, especially if that media is packaged in a way to make it look much worse than it is, or manipulated in some way. So unfortunately, this is the new world that we live in. Social media has become basically a bully pulpit for anyone who wants a voice, and oftentimes they're going to use what is said in those meetings as fuel against the board. And so this gets back to the professionalism that our board members and staff have to be trained on, so that we can avoid that conflict situation. We know how to respond in a professional way. We know what our legal options are, so that we don't have to put ourselves in a position where we could say or do something that's going to haunt us later. But this gets to the upfront training, which is what I really appreciate about your organization. You stress this as much or more than anyone, and I think that really empowers the board to handle those situations with grace and legally.
Mhm. Yeah, in that example or direction that you just offered, what's important there is that it's okay. You don't have to be defensive and tell the person that they're not allowed to do that and try and get into a frustrated situation where you push them out, right? They have certain rights. We need to make sure that we're protecting that and doing so in an orderly manner that allows them to feel like they're able to be part of it, right? Which is a really big, important take for us. Hannah, did you have anything to add on to that, or would you like me to move on?
No, absolutely. Couple of things that when you talked about an open forum, something that just popped into my mind, and I think again helps to de-escalate so many things, is having town halls also helps promote open communication. This is often a slightly less formal setting than a board meeting. So people, and if there's large things happening in the association that people have a lot of questions around, this enables the board to bring sometimes the experts, the engineers, the contractors, the association's attorney, to provide updates around people. So again, trying to disseminate any kind of conspiracy theories that are growing. And we can always encourage the residents to send the questions in advance so that we are prepared to answer them. And it can be, again, a productive session. It's not more than trying to stay away from the sort of gotcha situations where residents have a lot of theories and things that they think are happening, and they want to try and catch people off guard. And that's when possibly the videoing of the recording of the session starts, because board members are fumbling around, possibly trying to find the right answers, but if they lean towards their experts to help provide the right answers, it definitely helps de-escalate any conflict. And again, if we were very open and honest, and the session can be recorded, the board members provide the answers that are either by the rules and regulations, by the statute, the contract that has been signed, there's no reason for the interaction to become confrontational, and then the need for videotaping it goes away, right? Only when there's sort of confrontational backwards and forwards does it become a necessary situation. And you can provide the answers and move on to the next question. It doesn't need to be an ongoing backwards and forwards between a disgruntled resident and the board.
It's a good point to share that you don't have to have just a board meeting. You can also have town halls, particularly for larger initiatives. And it's important to know that communication and connectivity with residents and boards is really being a heavily discussed topic. So much so that, Dan, as you know, our legislative session here in Florida just concluded, and there was a lot of discussion about just that, resident communications and involvements in meetings. Recognizing that we'll have more people on the line than just Florida, we also represent communities in Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, and so on. Would love your take on maybe what the Florida legislative session is trying to achieve, what your thoughts are on that, and what you think this might mean for boards as they continue to deal with rising tension and conflicts as we've been discussing.
Yeah, well, there were, in fact, some new changes that will go into effect as soon as the governor signs the bills, which we all do expect will happen shortly, that are aimed at, on the condo side at least, increasing this transparency and meeting participation rights for owners. So what the new laws will provide in the condo context is that there will be a requirement to hold at least 4 board meetings per year, or once per quarter, if you're not already doing that, which you should be. And at least 4 times per year, the meeting agenda will be required to include an open forum session. This is something that a lot of communities do presently, and a lot used to do and stopped doing because it started getting unproductive, and members started, acting a little more unprofessionally and unruly. So a lot of times that has been now shut down. So by law, just as a reminder, here in Florida, owners have the opportunity not only to attend your meetings, and by the way, this is owners only, so you are not required to permit non-owners, meaning those owners that are not on the deed, into your meetings. So if a problematic person, happens to be a non-owner, you're welcome to keep them out. But for your owners, they are entitled to not only attend your meetings, but participate in the meetings. So the law currently says that participation means they can speak on your agenda items. The new law will say that at least once per quarter, or 4 times per year, there will be an open forum session. Also, at all board meetings for the condos, regardless of the agenda for that meeting, owners will now be permitted to ask questions about ongoing construction projects, financial matters, and a wonderful new catch-all category of, quote, other issues affecting the condominium, which is basically everything. So I think the intent of the legislation is good. I'm sure there are still communities that are not being as transparent as they should be or are required to be, but I fear that this might cause problems unintentionally because boards, things happen slowly in association world sometimes, okay? And by nobody's fault, we've got volunteer boards. We've got a limited number of vendors or contractors in this state that are trying to do an overwhelming number of projects. And so things tend to evolve slowly over time. Owners, however, if they're affected by the situation, want immediate results. Again, tying back to the fact that this is their home, this is their castle. If they're being disturbed or perceive some issue with their home, they want that resolved immediately. We can't always resolve everything immediately. So my fear with the new laws is that owners are going to have the opportunity to ask about items that are going on that the board really is not prepared to tackle at that particular month. So my best advice to boards is simply to say, thank you for the questions. What we're going to do is bring your question back, do a little due diligence. We'll plan to have this as an agenda item coming up, or maybe we'll do an e-blast or send a letter out with a little update. You are not required to give an on-the-spot answer. And with the new laws as well, I want to follow up on what Hannah said to make sure that this wasn't lost, because it's one of the biggest pieces of advice that I give to my clients. Bring in the professionals to help moderate these difficult discussions. Many condominiums are going through tremendously significant projects and changes right now that have come into play over the last couple of years with the changes in the law. If you need to have the attorney, the engineer, the insurance agent, the CPA, or the general contractor, come in and sit in a meeting, answer questions directly, make a presentation, give a progress report. Those are usually the best resources that you have to produce accurate information. A lot of what we see and the root cause of a lot of this problem, as Hannah referred to earlier, is either a misperception or a miscommunication. These board members sometimes simply are just not prepared to speak on, like, for example, an engineering situation that goes way above their expected level of comprehension. So and that's not a slight on the board. You're not expected to be an expert. You're expected to know when to go to the expert to get opinions to rely on. So the same is true for communication of this information back to your membership. Do yourself a service and don't speak out of turn. Don't try to do too much. It's not to punish the member or withhold information. It's to make sure they get the right and accurate information. So I think that's very important, and it's only becoming more and more transparent. This state is very much honed in on making sure that owners are aware of what's going on and have avenues of communication with the board. And that's a good thing if we're doing things correctly.
What you just said there, right? You don't necessarily have to have the answer, but saying that, right? Saying, hey, that's a really great question, letting somebody know that they were heard, that their curiosity is important and founded, and that we'll find the right answer for them and get back to them. That's a really great tactic to receive somebody's feedback and manage that situation. So thank you for sharing how to do that. We've talked quite a bit about how we can communicate outwardly to minimize confusion, to open up visibility and transparency, have a plan in place. We've talked about those things. But I would also love to know, how can we set expectations for residents on how to effectively communicate when they disagree with the board on an issue or have another point of view on a topic, like a violation that they might have received? Dan, what type of feedback would you offer in that situation?
This is the easy one, but easier said than done, because the simple answer is just remember the golden rule. Treat others as you would expect to be treated. This is something we learn as children, and it seems like we forget as adults, as we become more stressed or more entitled, or whatever the case may be, leading to why we're having this exact webinar. But if we can remind our owners that the board is trying their best, and if the more that the owners come with patience, respect, professionalism, and again, bring these skills that they learned through years or decades of service to their communities or their family or their job, if they bring those values back to our boardroom, we are going to have a tremendously better time trying to work out these very difficult problems. When I sit in meetings and try to help resolve these issues, in real time, often what I'm saying to the membership is, this is a partnership. The board is not up here, dictating to you. They're affected by every single decision that's being made. They don't just, drive off and go to some other neighborhood and, pack up and say good day at work. They're living right here. They are affected by everything that's happening. So they are oftentimes as frustrated as you, but they are tasked with handling this professionally. So the more the member can be reminded that they are also tasked with acting professionally and respectfully in this setting. It is a corporate meeting, in a board setting. So it gets very personal because this is the neighborhood, but we're also running a corporation where the board has a fiduciary duty to act in a certain professional way, and they engage professionals to help them do that. So we ask for that in return, and then we can kind of see eye to eye and be on the level. We may agree to disagree. That's another great value that we can bring. It's healthy to have debate. It's healthy to have dissent. That's all good. When we hear another perspective, sometimes it does kind of allow us to think of something a little bit differently in our own mind. This is also why we may want to table things. If we have a healthy discussion in a board setting and we're hearing both sides, and the board may be dead set on making a decision that night, it takes courage sometimes to say, this was a healthy conversation, and you know what, we've got some things to think about. We're going to table this. Maybe we're going to go back and have another conversation with the professional who's going to help us resolve this, but you've been heard. audience, we may end up following through with this intended decision, but we're going to take a little extra time here and come back when we're ready to make a decision. There's nothing wrong with that. These decisions are very impactful financially, physically, and emotionally, really, for our members. So do the due diligence, boards out there. We know we want to get stuff done, and we're getting pressure to do that, but we also want to make the right decisions.
Yeah, being able to share with the homeowners, hey, you've given us something to think about, right? That's a very fair statement. And then we'll come back to you. Also, on the preceding end of that, before you create this series where people can stand up and talk, we all want to feel safe, welcome, heard, and the management teams can do a really great job by setting the stage before people have the opportunity to talk, if that's been granted for the meeting, by saying that, hey, we don't want to develop groupthink. We want to foster creativity. If you have an alternative idea or would like to talk about something that we should be discussing or learning or thinking about, we want to hear from you. So this is, homeowner, your safe space to come and talk and know that your voice will be heard. By just coming up with the 1 to 2 sentences that you want to share with the community before then can really help to set the tone before residents get up to speak. And it can then foster a culture of, hey, I know I will be heard, right? And then homeowners talk to their neighbors, right? Well, I had a challenge with the board a few months ago, and I went and talked with them and was able to have my voice heard, and I felt comfortable enough to speak, and things along those lines. It then fosters that continued open dialogue that if someone does have a problem, they can tell them how to walk through that, right? Which is great. Hannah, anything that you'd like to add on to that topic when it comes to sharing with residents how best to manage their messaging back to boards?
I think the example that you just gave is perfect as far as setting the tone right from the moment the meeting starts. Often we can be in the situation that there's been a lot of chatter in the association around an upcoming meeting or an upcoming topic. I know here I'm located in South Florida, there are a lot of internal group chats on WhatsApp and those kind of devices, and that kind of information seeps back out to the board and the management. And often we can go into a meeting with a preconceived notion of the way it's going to go, right? Based on all this chatter that's around. But it's very important, like Amy just said, is to put all that to one side, open the meeting in a very positive, open, collaborative type environment, so then the owners do have the opportunity to talk. And we have found, and Dan and I have smiled about this, that sort of 9 times out of 10, the meetings that we go into where we have a feeling that it's going to be the most contentious often is not, as people want to come and have constructive conversations if everybody in the room has the same mindset and wants to move forward in a positive direction together, and it doesn't start out as a confrontational type situation. Which that I feel is huge. And then one other topic that Amy touched on slightly, which also can go a long way to helping owners minimize conflict, is when they're able to self-resolve situations. There is nothing more frustrating than being at home, maybe on a Friday night or a weekend, and maybe you're trying to pay your association dues, and for some reason it's not what it should be, or it's not what you thought it was going to be, and there's just a super simple question that you need an answer to, but you don't know how to get it. So it's very important for the management team and the board to go back and review all of the policies and the communication that has been made to the members as to who to call, when, and for what, and on what type of technology. Sometimes we have a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week customer service center that can answer numerous questions for all of our owners, and then often individual associations have their own technology, possibly an app or a communication platform where you can put in a work order or request for your guests to come and stay for the weekend without having to reach out to anybody specifically or send an email and wait for a response, call an office, leave a voicemail, not get a response. And when we have these processes in place, we must make sure that they're communicated clearly so that the owners and the members can take an opportunity of that.
Yeah, absolutely, Hannah. There's nothing more frustrating. Most of us try to resolve our own items ourselves, right? We're conditioned to do that. If we've got an issue with our credit card, we just go to the app and we fix something. And so most residents are conditioned the same way. They want to self-solve. And so having the property management team take a moment to just check, how do owners really know how to resolve? Do they have their app, if they've got a management company, downloaded? Do they know how to get into their into the system? Do they know how to do those things? And taking a moment to take a look at that can really help. In high-rise buildings, it's you know who your staff is, you know how to get a hold of your concierge desk. In horizontal properties where you're part of a single-family residential community, is the phone number to get to the management team or the 800 center out and about? Do they have access to that? When was the last time that it was sent to them, so that they know how to resolve something can really minimize that. We are running pretty good on time, and there is a question that somewhat parlays into what we've just been talking about, because we've been talking about meetings and how to help residents self-solve things. And what John asked is, what can be done if we get poor attendance at board meetings? We've tried posting a week in advance, so they've tried extending out the time frame to notify homeowners in advance. We're all busy, we've got busy schedules, but maybe still lackluster attendance. What can a community do to bolster how they're connecting with homeowners?
Hannah, you want to tackle
Yes,
this?
absolutely. My question would be, how are you communicating? I know you said it in advance, but is it purely just an email, or are you putting notices in the elevators? Are you putting notices at the front desk? Not sure if you're a high-rise or a horizontal community, but if there is an app where messages can be posted, and then just a combination of all of the above. If there is a texting platform as well, because as we said, lots of people, there's in their personal emails, things get lost often, so people receive their information differently. So sometimes just a text, hey, there's a meeting in 48 hours, can get people's interest heightened again. And then maybe it's bringing other people into the meeting, maybe to bring in different points of view, like Dan talked about earlier, bringing in experts that can provide different answers or questions, or to provide updates, depends what kind of topics that you're discussing in your meetings.
My first gut reaction to that is just that, John, it sounds like you're running a really great community, because when people are really frustrated, Dan, did I say what you were going to say? Usually when, people are really satisfied with the leadership team and how things are running, they're not interested in showing up. It's when things are confusing or things don't make sense where you start to get a larger body. So it sounds like you're doing you're building enough confidence within your community to not drive an outpouring of attendance. That's not a hard and fast rule. You might still have a population of the community that's frustrated about something, and so I would certainly go back to what Hannah was just sharing and following the multiple modes of communication. What we do a ton of work around understanding the best forms of communication within, at FirstService Residential. And what we found is that communication is really generational. So some homeowners really prefer to get an email or a phone call, text, even social media, and some of the younger generations that are buying homes. So the more options that you've got, and I know that I said a spicy one there with social media, which I know throws a little bit of how do we do that? And there's a lot of topic that comes off of that. But if you're following those main channels of communication to get out to your homeowners that it's what's going on and what's going to be discussed, and you still don't have a lot of people showing up, that means that your leadership team is doing a really solid job of getting the message out there, allowing accessibility, and we would encourage you to continue to do that. Also, the only other point that I'd add on to that is, if you're not using a virtual component, consider it. We've got a lot of fast-moving homes, like we've talked about, and so people can sometimes jump on virtually where they wouldn't necessarily be able to be live.
Yeah, I would agree, and that was the point that I was going to make as well. You know, you can utilize the virtual tools even if you do a hybrid model. So you're going to sit in the room together, but also have a laptop there and broadcast via Zoom. That's a perfectly legal way to conduct your meetings, even if we wanted to do Zoom only meetings. You know, and do so all the communication up front and doing extra communications and various forms of communications to get people to go to the meetings is all wonderful. It's also aspirational. We know that most of your community is not going to show up at the board meetings. So what I would tell you is plan for that and just communicate after the board meeting. Make sure that some kind of e-blast, you know, goes out. Yes, you have to keep minutes legally of that meeting, but the minutes are usually, you know, fairly streamlined and straightforward, only covering action items. If you want to do something more and provide a summary, don't provide a summary in the minutes. The minutes are a corporate tool. Provide your summary in either like some kind of email communication or newsletter communication. Post a little summary on the official, you know, Facebook page or website of the community, and then encourage owners to go back on their own time and just review, you know, what was done. And there should be a nice, concise way for them to do that. One location that they know to check in once a month, once a quarter, just to see what is happening. So sometimes it's just sort of playing catch up on the back end.
Mhm.
And one other point that just come to me is that what we've seen in the past too is I'm starting to think about, let's make sure that you're having your meetings at the right time. Not quite sure what the right time might be for your association, whether it's 5 p.m., 6 p.m., 7 p.m. And then the way to find that out, and also a way to find out possibly why people are not coming. There's a great tool called Survey Monkey, or sending out a survey to your communities, asking them, you know, are things going okay? Why don't you attend the meetings? Is it because of the wrong time, or everything's great, or you don't need to provide any input, you know? And maybe just 5 or 6 quick questions, and then you can get a pulse from your community as to what their thoughts are, and you know, why they're not coming to the meetings. And hopefully, like Amy said, it's because everything's going great, and they have all faith in the board and the management team.
Absolutely. And our team could certainly help with that, if that's something you'd like for us to do. It looks like we've got time for one more question. There was one that was posted that says, are bullying tactics and calling out a board member or property manager considered a violation?
I'll tackle this first, I guess. It depends. So, you know, unfortunately, the conversation we have to have with board members is also that they are taking on a public role within their community, which means they are going to be subject to scrutiny and sometimes criticism. And everybody's sensitivities are a little different. So what may be considered bullying or harassment to one person may be kind of normal, standard operating, you know, procedure for someone else who's used to getting that, you know, in the boardroom at work or somewhere, you know, in another public setting if they're volunteering in another board or something. So you know, there's a line, there's a legal definition, and that's where you work with your professionals to determine whether what you're perceiving to be bullying, you know, is in fact legally actionable bullying. But these are, you know, somewhat subjective situations that become difficult to tackle. So best thing I can tell you is document the situation, consult with legal counsel, talk through it, and see what their opinion is on whether or not the behavior is actionable. If it's actionable and really does constitute a threat or is, you know, outside the bounds of the normal type of communication or constructive criticism that we should expect as board members, then a cease and desist letter from the attorney would be appropriate. You know, in those letters, we basically just tell the member, look, what you're doing goes beyond the pale that we would expect. Board members are volunteers. You need to conduct yourself professionally. And perhaps at this point, you need to stop communicating directly with the board and communicate with management for the time being until we get this resolved. So it's, you know, these are going to be case by case situations. And if there is in fact a breach, yes, it can be a violation, and yes, it can be addressed legally.
Great feedback, Dan. Thank you for that. I would also add that the more human element that you can bring to a moment like that, the more you can gauge what to do next. And what I mean by that is we've all shown up extra grumpy or angry and been diffused by somebody who was just really kind and nice and patient with us. And then after that, we melt and say, you know what? you feel really bad about that situation, but all of a sudden you have a lot more trust in that individual that you connected with because they allowed to help you through that process. So not all situations can be diffused like that. Apply the human element wherever you can, and if not, escalate appropriately. But make sure you've got a plan in place and work with your teams to define what that looks like.
And don't forget too that when you're conducting your meetings on Zoom, the mute button is your best friend. Don't be afraid to use it.
Great clip. Thank you, Dan. To Dan and Hannah, thank you so much for joining us for our virtual event and being our experts on today's panel. To all of our guests, thank you for jumping on to Ask the Experts, Managing Resident Conflict Like a Pro. We hope you found today's conversation helpful and took away some nuggets today. We hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Same.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everybody.